Who is my favorite god? I'm frequently asked by commenters and the like who my favorite god is, and I don't like to answer because I think it's a personal matter. However, I will today talk at length about my preferred deity, and that is the god known as Ingui-Frey, or more popularly, Freyr. Frey is a sovereign lord of increase and prosperity. He is mentioned in many sources, unlike most of the Norse gods for whom we have very little written evidence. Nevertheless, he is still neglected by people who are interested in paganism and people who study him. They don't realize quite how important his role was in the pagan religion practiced by the Germanic pagan people. One of the most famous sources, and one that everyone knows about, is Adam of Bremen. Adam of Bremen doesn't reveal very much, but he does say that Freyr was one of the three principal deities worshipped here at Uppsala, and that he was a bringer of peace among his people, and that he was associated with marriages, and that his idol in the temple at Uppsala was represented with a phallus, and this has heavily influenced popular representations of him today. The Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus also wrote about Frey around the same time, and he said that Frey was worshipped here at Uppsala, same as Adam said. He also mentions a great sacrifice called Fröblod, which took place there at regular intervals and involved human sacrifice. He refers to the worship of Frey accompanied by what he described as effeminate gestures and the clapping of mimes upon stage, together with the unmanly clutter of bells. This indicates some kind of performance, probably ritual performance, similar to you had in Greek theatre. Whatever it was that the devotees of Freyr were doing at Uppsala, it was very frowned upon by Saxo the Christian, and he described it as unmanly. Now we could say that a whole load of things we can interpret. Either that the human sacrifice and the supposedly unmanly activities were both the inventions of Saxo in an effort to discredit the pagan religion, or we could say that they did take place but they had been misinterpreted, or indeed they took place and they were not misinterpreted, and that perhaps there was something involved in that ritual where some men had to take on female roles in that particular performance. I'm not sure why bells particularly are associated with an unmanliness by Saxo, since the bell is usually a symbol of Christianity. But in this case, he didn't think it was a very manly thing. We certainly know that he was a fertility deity from these two things, and since these two sources both said, I think we can safely say that he was an important god here in Uppsala, and also that's reinforced by the Yngling, which is an Icelandic source, and references the early Swedish kings, who are all descended from the god Ing, and that's Ingui-Frey, and they also were prominent around this area of Sweden. The Swedes believed that their kings had the power to bring peace and plenty to the land, the power of Freyr. In that sense, the king was an earthly representation of divinity, Freyr, and we see that same notion carried on later in the Christian times, in Anglo-Saxon England, for example, and in all traditional societies, where monarchy is justified through its divine association. And, the king and the land are one, and in this sense, Freyr, the god of prosperity, and a divine sovereign is linked to the earthly sovereign, who is his blood descendant in that metaphysical sense. The oldest reference to this god, I think we can go back to Tacitus, who talks about one of the Germanic tribes, the Ingvi-Frey, and then also the Yngling, referred to in Beowulf. That seems to refer to the same as the Ynglinga in the Icelandic sources, and all of these imply descent from this divine ancestor Ingvi, who probably was at one point more important than Odin. What I wrote about in my dissertation in 2012, the Riding to the Afterlife, which you can read online, is that there was a very important horse cult in Germanic paganism. And of course, horses were prominent in all Indo-European religions. And I could go into great detail about that. I don't have time in this video, but you should read my dissertation if you want to know about its role in Germanic religion. But suffice to say, in this video, Freyr was certainly linked in some ways to it, although I say in my dissertation there are some elements of horse sacrifice and ritual use of horses and prognostication of horses that may not be related to him, because it seems that all deities in some respect were connected to horses, or many at least. But there are some rituals I specifically identify with this god Freyr. It is said in the sagas that sacred horses were kept in his sanctuary at Thrandheim in Norway. In Flateyjarbók, the Christianizer Olaf Tryggvason, who was a brutal Christian man, was going around killing people and trying to make everyone Christian, kidnapping children and forcing the parents to convert for the hostages. Olaf saw that the sacrifice was about to take place. He rode the horse, which was sacred and therefore forbidden to be ridden by any mortal man, and that was a direct defiance of the god. And then he rode it to the temple, where he defiled the deities and carried the image of the god Frey outside under his arm in a sacrilegious act. Similarly, we have in Hrafnkel saga, the man Hrafnkel has a stallion dedicated to the god Freyr, and he also has a stud of 12 mares, all of them dedicated to Freyr. He shared all his possessions with Freyr, but the most important was this stallion called Freyfaxi, which means the mane of Freyr. Only Hrafnkel was allowed to ride it because it had been devoted to the god, and he therefore, in devoting it to the god, had a positive duty of protection to that dedicated offering of the horse. Therefore, anyone else who rode that horse had to be killed by him, and that's actually the main topic of that saga. There's also another horse with the name Freyfaxi in Vatnsdala saga, and the sons of Ingemund, who are all worshippers of Freyr, they attend horse fights, and it seems that somehow the horse fights that Icelanders participated in were also associated with this god. They may have had a ritual aspect where they bring two horses together and have them fight each other, basically. That was a popular thing in Iceland, and it does look like there may be depictions of it on some runestone, and also on one of the golden horns of Galeas from Denmark, which are from the migration era. They actually have what appears to be a horse fight or a horse race in some kind of ritual depicted on them. There are so many horse burials and horse cremations in Scandinavia and England. The cremations are most likely to be towards Frey, because the inhumations, where they're in burial mounds, the horses that are buried with bridal gear and sometimes with war gear, and that indicates that these horses were used in battle. But from what if we take the sagas as being indicative of how Frey's horse cult was practiced, then those horses weren't used for anything like that. They were dedicated and kept separate from work horses, so they probably wouldn't have been buried with any bridal gear or riding gear. It doesn't make any sense. So I speculated in my essay that the cremated horses are more likely to be the ones associated with Freyr. In Beowulf, the Hrothgar is said to be in possession of stallions, a group of stallions, possibly similar to like Hrafnkel. They were dedicated to Freyr, and also like King Edwin of Northumbria, who is said to have owned the herds of Ingui across Dara in northern England. Edwin probably himself claimed descent from the god Ingui, and that's what my professor at university wrote in his book, Heathen Gods in Old English Literature. He also wrote that the ideology appears to be implicit in the double entendre Superstitio Uanatatis, the superstition of the Unani, which is Bede's term for the beliefs that the pagan priest of the Anglo-Saxons, Coifi, cast aside when he took arms and mounted a stallion, and then he threw a spear into the pagan temple, in what is described by Bede as a major conversion event among the pagan Anglo-Saxons. But my professor, Richard North, said that the name Uani is in fact the Anglo-Saxon cognate, a Latinized version of the cognate for Vanir. As well as horses, Freyr and his sister Freya are both associated with wild boar. The Icelander Snorri Sturlusson wrote that Frey has the golden bristled boar Gullinbursti, who was made by the dwarves and could run faster than any steed, so rather brings the horse cult into question a bit if he has such a fast boar. Freya also has a boar. She has one called Hildisvin. So the association between the boar and the fertility gods is probably very old. René Guénon actually wrote about the importance of the boar in European pagan religions, and he associates it with a cult of wisdom. But it seems it was also, the evidence does indicate, as I said in my boar video, which you should watch, that the boar was an Indo-European symbol of war. To me, that indicates that the roles of Freyr were once much more nuanced than his simple fertility deity, and that he was himself associated with war, hence the boar, and also the fact that he wields a sword in some descriptions of him. So he may have just sort of diversified his roles, or as other deities took on the war role, he became more specialized in his metaphysical function as a deity of plenty and benevolence and the fertility of the land. A lot of people have written for a long time about whether the Vanir and Asir war represents the coming of the Indo-Europeans, and that the clash of these two peoples, the Indo-Europeans, the invading would have been the corded ware culture who brought the Indo-European language into Scandinavia, and then became the stone boat axe culture, that is. During this era of conflict, the Indo-European gods became the Asir, and the gods that had been worshipped by the descendants of the hunter-gatherers that lived in Scandinavia already, their deities became the Vanir. That theory has been contested strongly, but I still think that the theory holds weight. Not in a literal sense. It may not be that the god Freyr, as we now have had him passed down to us in the Viking sources, is identical to a god that was worshipped by the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of Scandinavia. In a metaphysical sense, the truth of the two deities was recognized by everyone, and that as the peoples blended, the diversity of and plurality of perception of divinity was resolved by the integration of two different pantheons. Now, they may actually both have taken names of Indo-European deities, and they may not in fact represent the actual deity, the actual pantheons exactly as they were prior to the movement into Scandinavia, but they still reflect that time in some respect. The Hindu Shiva, like Freyr, was a principal male deity for an indigenous population, and they were each associated with magical disciplines. As the lord of the gods of an invading people, Odin had to learn this magic known by the Vanir as Seidr. Conversely, it is only when he sits on Hlidskjalf, the throne of Odin, that Freyr can see into all realms as Odin does. Now, the name Freyr means lord. He was also known as Ingui-Frey or Ingui-Frey to the Anglo-Saxons. So this name can truly be understood as Lord Ingwi. Similarly, one of the names of Odin was the Lord God. In England, descent from Woden was required in order to be able to claim the right of kingship, while in Sweden it was Freyr's blood that was associated with sacral kingship. But the right to kingship derived from descent from Ingui-Frey may have also been present among Anglo-Saxons, for there is a connection between the ancient Ingveonis, mentioned by Tacitus, the Yngling referred to in Beowulf, and the Ynglinga from Icelandic sources. All of these imply descent from an ancestor named Ing or Ingvi. Woden, or Odin's kingship cult, is not attested by sources anywhere near as old as Tacitus. So it seems that gradually Odin became more important, taking the role of the ancestor required to legitimize a royal claim. It's unlikely that those who cited gods as an ancestor ever thought it was appropriate to substitute one for another due to changing fashions. So this raises the possibility that these two gods were interchangeable for another reason. The Ynglinga saga relates that Odin owned a magical ship called Skidbladnir, which could be folded up like a cloth. But according to Gylfaginning, it was Freyr who owned that ship. This is not because the deities have been confused in the different sources, but because they have been intentionally conflated. It may be that Lord Ing, who abides in Alheimer, the abode of the light elves, was the primordial god of the indigenous Northern European peoples, and that some of his characteristics were absorbed by Odin as the two pantheons were merged following the invasion of Indo-European tribes. For this reason, the duality of Odin as Rudra, the Indo-European god of Hinduism, who reflects the invading destroyer known as the Terrible One, Lord of the Fallen, Wanderer, the one in gaping frenzy, the god of the hanged, spear charger, father of hosts, and god of battle, but also Odin as a version of Shiva, who's like Lord Ing, and in this form he is known as the Ancient One, Deceiver, Riddler, Yeller, Teacher of Gods, the mighty one and the wise one. And perhaps I'm overreaching by conflating the two gods of the Vanir and the Asir in this way, but it should be remembered that all gods in Indo-European tradition reflect one divinity. So in that sense, all deities, as in Hinduism, all deities are in fact Brahma. And in that sense, when in Hinduism we compare Rudra and Shiva as two elements of the same thing, we're also remembering that all gods are in fact elements of the same thing. My interpretation of Ingui-Frey is that he is another side of the same role of a Lord God, a royal God, just like Odin, but perhaps he comes from a different source, or he may be a memory of a religion that preceded the Indo-European one, but that was incorporated into it. And we know that Indo-Europeans definitely did that wherever they went. Not just because of Hinduism, like the incorporation of Shiva into Rudra and the other non-Indo-European gods they have, such as Ganesh and many others, but we could take a look at the Hittites. The Hittites came down into what's now Turkey and established an empire there, and they interacted with Semitic peoples to their borders, and sometimes they practiced syncretism, which is like in the case of that I'm describing here with Odin and Ingvi-Frey becoming one, or in the case of Rudra and Shiva being two sides of the same god. And sometimes the Hittites did that too. But in most cases, the Hittites did not do that. In fact, they simply added more and more deities to their pantheon until they became known by their neighbors as the tribe of 1,000 gods. This could be seen as, from a traditional perspective, as a type of decadence, with so many gods and so many diverse perspectives that it becomes impossible to reach the truth of divinity. But if you understand the real meaning of so-called polytheism, you understand that all of these reflect one truth, one supreme truth, and one, in that sense, one God. So, there you have it. Ingui-Frey, the Lord God, a European god.